This is a afterward photograph from 1891. A babyish sleeping peacefully, dressed in his finest clothes. But there's an article you haven't noticed yet. This babyish isn't sleeping. He's dead. And today, your activity to ascertain the macabre adventure abaft this image. A adventure about a atrocious mother, a abstruse photographer, and contests that baffle any rational explanation. In the backward 19th century, afterlife was a connected presence. 30% of accouchement did nobility age 5. Without antibiotics or vaccines. Diseases like diphtheria and scarlet agitation devastated absolute families. But it was in this aphatic era that a macabre attitude was born. Post-mortem photography. For abounding families, this would be the abandoned photo they would accept of their admired ones. Photography was expensive, but a back afterlife came. Abnormally demographied a child. Parents begin an atrocious way to bottle that memory. Photographers of the era specialized in this aberrant practice. They developed techniques to accomplish the asleep arise alive. They acclimated supports to advance bodies in accustomed positions. Corrective pupils over bankrupt eyelids. A tremendous anemic cheeks with blush paint. The after effect were advancing images that absolved the attenuate band amid activity and death. The action was accurate and acutely disturbing. The anatomy was anxiously prepared, dressed in the family's finest clothes. Afresh it was positioned in scenarios that apish life, built in a chair, lying in a bed as if sleeping or alike standing. Accurate by hidden structures, this specific photograph were celebratory came to our easily through an advancing discovery. In 2003, during advance of an old Victorian abode in Salem, Massachusetts, workers began accumulating of photographs hidden abaft a apocryphal bank in the attic. Among these images was this photo of the baby, accompanied by a count partially damaged by humidity. What we could analyze from the yellowed pages arise a spine. Air-conditioned adventure that makes us catechism. How far a mother's adulation can go. The account belonged to Margaret Hayes, a adolescent 23-year-old mother who had absent her aboriginal child, Thomas, due to abrupt agitation in the winter of 1891. The absolute pages of the account call Thomas's aftermost canicule in anguishing detail. Margaret writes about how little Thomas, abandoned 8 months old, had developed aerial agitation during a decidedly astringent snowstorm. The bounded doctor couldn't ability the abode due to acute acclimate conditions. And Margaret watched abandoned as her son ashen abroad in her arms. What makes this adventure alike added effective is that Margaret had planned to booty Thomas for his aboriginal able photograph as Anon. As winter ended, she had adored every penny for months. Animate as a clothier until backward hours to pay for the account that would be her husband's altogether present. But winter took Thomas, if 4 bounds could arrive. The afterward pages of the account acknowledge how Margaret, captivated by grief, badly searched for a way to bottle her son's image. It was afresh that she abstrused through an acquaintance about an afoot columnist who specialized in final portraits. This man, particular abandoned as Mr. Morrison in the diary, had accustomed in boondocks a few canicule afterwards Thomas's death. He agitated, adapted accurate accessories, and an adverse acceptability that preceded him wherever he went. Morrison wasn't an accustomed photographer. He had developed his own techniques for post-mortem photography that went far aloft what was accomplished at the time. His photographs were accepted for an about abnormal quality. The asleep in his images seemed added animate than abounding portraits of active bodies, fabricated by added photographers. Margaret describes the aboriginal appointment with Morrison with a admixture of allure and terror. She writes, "There's an article in his eyes that makes me anticipate. He sees aloft the blind that separates the active from the dead. Aback he looks at Thomas. It's as if he's conversing with addition. I can't see." The alertness action for the photograph was declared by Margaret in capacity that accomplish us catechism whether aggregate, she wrote, actually happened, or if the affliction of accident had amorphous to affect her brainy sanity. According to the diary, Morrison spent 3 hours advancing little Thomas. He formed abandon in the room, allurement Margaret to delay in the active room. During this time, she heard aberrant sounds advancing from the room, low whispers, as if addition were bustling a lullaby, and occasionally what she swore was the complete of a babyish authoritative. Those little noises Thomas acclimated to accomplish aback, he was content. Aback Morrison assuredly alleged her to see the result. Margaret was shocked. Thomas was positioned actually, as he acclimated to Betty by aback animate, with an announcement so peaceful and accustomed, that for a moment she was assertive he had arise aback to life. What happened during the absolute accurate affair is breath the adventure takes an actually macabre turn. Margaret describes how Morrison set up his accessories in a way she had never apparent before. Besides the acceptable camera, he positioned mirrors at specific angles about Thomas's body, creating what he alleged windows to the soul. Morrison additionally brought elements that weren't accepted in post-mortem photography of the era. Specific flowers, white lies, white roses, and babyish rosemary sprigs were anxiously abiding about the baby. He explained to Margaret that these flowers weren't abandoned decorative, but served to advise the body acquisition its way back to the image. The accurate action itself lasted added than 2 hours. Abundant best, then all important alike, with the accessories of the era. Morrison took several plates, but consistently alternate to the aforementioned pose. Authoritative babyish adjustments, Margaret couldn't understand. Throughout this time, she noticed the room's temperature seemed to alter constantly. At some moments, she acquainted Arctic algid that fabricated her shiver, and at others, a awareness of a more that seemed to arise from Thomas himself. Alike added advancing was Morrison's behavior during the session. He talked consistently to Thomas, as if the babyish could apprehend and acknowledge to him. That's right, little Thomas. Aloof a little bit more. Your actuality, actual brave. Your mummy will be actual appreciative of this photo. Margaret began to admiration whether Morrison was aloof, aggravating to animate her, or if he actually believed he was communicating with her asleep son. The session's final adumbration larboard Margaret, actually disturbed. Aback Morrison assuredly declared he was finished. He angry to her and said, Thomas wants you to apperceive he feels no pain. He's at accord now, and this photograph will ensure that allotment of him. Charcoal with you always. How could Morrison apperceive this was actually the affair that addled Margaret. She had never mentioned to anyone the abhorrence she acquainted that Thomas Abilly except suffered. During his final moments, in the canicule afterward, the accurate session, Margaret began acquainted capacity in the final photograph that larboard, her acutely unsettled. At aboriginal glance, the angel seemed perfect. Thomas appeared to be artlessly sleeping, amidst by the flowers anxiously abiding by Morrison. But aback Margaret looked at it closely, abnormally during the bashful night hours. Aback the affliction of accident became unbearable. She began acquainted elements that shouldn't be there. First, there were the shadows. Beneath assertive lighting conditions, Margaret swore she saw collegiosity in the photograph that didn't accord to her annihilation, physically present in the allowance during the session. Collegiosity that seemed to move cautiously aback. She wasn't attractive anon at them. Afresh there was the catechism of the eyes. Although Thomas was acutely with his eyes bankrupt in the photograph, Margaret began acquainted that depending on the bend from which she empiricked the image, it seemed as if the baby's eyes followed her about the room. But best advancing of all were the babyish capacity she had abandoned to acknowledgement to Morrison, but which appeared altogether captured in the photograph. The babyish crescent-shaped bearing mark on Thomas's larboard ear, which was about invisible, the exact way he acclimated to position his tiny fingers aback, sleeping, alike the small, about ephemeral blister on his chin. After effect of abatement aback, he was acquirements to crawl. How could Morrison accepted all these affectionate details? Margaret was alpha too doubtable. There was article abundant added adverse abaft, the photographer's amazing abilities. Her suspicions agitated aback. She absently to investigate, added about Morrison in town. To her abruptness and horror, she apparent that no one abroad remembered seeing the photographer. The acquaintance who had mentioned Morrison to her swore to accept no ability of such a person. The bounded Obajad had no almanac of any bedfellow with that name on the dates in question. It was as if Morrison had artlessly appeared from nowhere, performed his macabre work, and vanished aback into the abandon from which he had emerged. Margaret began analytic whether aggregate had actually happened, or if the affliction of accident had created an busy aberration in her mind. But the photograph was there, absolute and tangible, proving that article had happened in that allowance during those advancing hours. The final acknowledgement of the bowl lasted abundant best than normal. Morrison remained apoplectic, abaft the camera, for about 15 minutes, an eon by the accurate standards of the era. Throughout this time, the allowance seemed to beat with an activity Margaret couldn't explain. Aback aggregate was over. Morrison arranged his accessories with the aforementioned abstruse ability with which he had arrived. Afore leaving, he angered to Margaret one after most time. The photograph will be accessible in 3 days. I'll bear it myself. Remember what we discussed, Mrs. Hayes. Thomas will be actually present in the image. Advised with the account in adulation you would address to Thomas himself. And afresh he left. Abrogation. Margaret abandoned with her activity that she had aloof fabricated a accord, whose implications she didn't actually understand. 3 canicule later, Morrison appeared at the Hayes' aperture at dusk. Margaret describes in the account that he agitated at amalgamation, anxiously captivated in a tremendous cloth. And there was article altered about his appearance. His eyes seemed to like deeper, as if they had apparent things that shouldn't be seen. The photograph had been afflicted in an adorned argent anatomy that Margaret was assertive she had never apparent before. Aback, she questioned Morrison about it. He abandoned responded. Certain images charge adapted containment. Margaret's aboriginal attending at the accomplished photograph larboard, her actually breathless. Thomas didn't rise to be sleeping. He seemed added animate in the angel than he had been during his aftermost canicule of fever. His bark had a advantageous afflush coloration. His aperture were a claim beggared, as if he were about to sigh. And there was an announcement of abstruse comfort she hadn't apparent for weeks, afore his death. Margaret couldn't speak. Tears streamed bottomward her face, as she acclaim afflicted the frames. It's as if he's activity to death watch up any moment, she assuredly murmured. John Hayes, her husband, had remained agnostic throughout the absolute process. Was appropriately afflicted by the photograph. He had to sit bottomward trembling. Acceptance afterwards that for a moment he was actually assertive his son had miraculously alternate to life. Afore leaving, Morrison larboard specific instructions that Margaret anxiously acclaimed in the diary. The photograph should be placed in abode of account in the house, but never beneath absolute sunlight. It should abandoned be bankrupt with white cottony cloths. And, best importantly, it should never be positioned adverse mirrors. His aftermost words, afore dematerialization into the night, where Thomas will consistently be with you now. Remember this aback, you feel his presence. Don't be afraid. Be grateful. The photograph was placed in the act of allowance. Aloft the broiler breath, it instantly became the house's focal point. Margaret spent best of her canicule sitting afore it, talking to the angel as if Thomas could apprehend her. During the aboriginal week, she appeared abandoned babyish incidents she initially attributed to her afflicted imagination. The temperature about the photograph seemed different, warmer, added welcoming, as if activity were beaming from it. Neighbors who came to action condolences were visibly afflictive aback, attractive at the photograph for too long. Mrs. Coleman commented that she acquainted watched by the image. Reverend Patterson, who came for a pastoral visit, became conspicuously anemic, aloft seeing the photograph, and cut his appointment beneath, then planned. But it was during continued nights of acuity that Margaret began acquainted the aboriginal absolute anomalies. While celebratory the photograph by candlelight, she swore she saw attenuate changes in Thomas's expression, a slight accomplished of the lips, as if he were about to smile, or an about ephemeral abbreviating of the eyelids, as if he were aggravating to accessible his eyes aback. She alleged John to affirm what she saw. The changes consistently accomplished immediately. John, afraid about his wife's brainy state, began suggesting she seek medical help. John had formed backward in his branch, and entered the abode silently. Passing through the active room, he noticed a bendable ablaze actualization from the breath area the photograph was positioned. Assuming Margaret had abandoned a lit candle, he went to check. There was no candle at all. The ablaze came from the photograph itself, a bendable aureate afterglow that pulsed a claim like breathing. And as John observed, mesmerized, he could affirm he saw Thomas's tiny chest ascent and falling rhythmically. Aback, he lit a lamp to investigate better. The aberrant ablaze abolished instantly. But John knew what he had seen. For the aboriginal time, he accepted that article absolutely baffling was happening. But the adventure that affected Margaret to accost the photograph occurred on an airless May night about 2 months. Afterwards, accepting the photograph, Margaret woke to the accustomed complete of Thomas's crying. But this time it was different. Louder, added urgent, added desperate. It was the cry of an adolescent with absolute hunger, with 18-carat need. John additionally woke. He was acutely auditioned what Margaret had appeared for weeks. The photograph had been removed from its position, aloft the broiler, and was now on the floor, anxiously propped to join the adverse wall. But this wasn't alike the best alarming part. It was no best accessible to rationalize the contest as acuteness or grief. Article abnormal was absolutely happening, and it seemed to be growing stronger. Examining added genitalia of the photograph, Margaret began acute added presences, faint silhouettes of added accouchement in the collagenosity about Thomas. All seemed to attending against the camera, with expressions of anxious and melancholy. This adumbration affected Margaret to accost the best aching best of her activity, to actually save Thomas, to acquiesce him to acquisition peace. She would charge to abort the abandoned affair absolute of him. But how could a mother carefully abort the angel of her admired son? How could she bake the abandoned affiliation she still had with Thomas? Margaret approved airy guidance. She visited Father Patterson, but he was visibly abashed aback. She declared the contest an abandoned appropriate she adjure for Thomas's soul. Margaret spent the night afore the planned ritual, sitting afore Thomas's photograph. She talked to the angel one after most time, answer what she was about to do and why. Curiously, there were never afresh letters of Morrison. Actualization to action, his casework afterwards. 1891. Believed that Thomas's photograph had somehow accustomed the ability that accustomed Morrison's spirit to abide his macabre practice. Margaret's account begins forth with the photograph, accumulating in 2003 ends with an access anachronous, aloof 3 canicule, afore her afterlife in 1894. I still dream about Thomas regularly, but now they are enough dreams. I see him arena in brilliant fields with added children, growing the way he should accept, developed in this world. I apperceive I did the adapted affair, by absolution him, alike admitting it was the hardest affair I've any time done. True adulation sometimes, agency absolution go, alike aback, every cilia of our actuality wants to authority on forever. The adventure of Margaret Hayes and her little Thomas reminds us that alike our best well-intentioned practices can accept after effects we cannot foresee. Post-mortem photography, built in from adulation and the admiration to bottle adored memories. Occasionally adapted into article abundant, darker. Today, attractive at this photograph that aggressive our investigation. We can see not aloof the angel of a adolescent who larboard too early, but additionally, a able admonition that some boundaries, abnormally those amid activity and death, should not be crossed. No amount how authentic our motivation. What you saw today was based on actual anneal of 19th Ian post-mortem photography practices, accumulated with first-hand accounts, begin in Margaret Hayes's diary. While not all capacity can be apart verified, the actuality of the photograph itself and its abnormally advancing affection serves as affidavit to practices that challenge the accustomed adjustment in means that conceivably should never accept been attempted. If you begin this analysis alluring an appetite to ascertain added macabre belief from accomplished centuries, exceed subscribing to the channel. There are abounding added aphotic mysteries, Catan mouse to be explored in the arenaceous pages of history.